Have you ever wondered why there was a time when something as normal as crying made people fear they were sick or losing control? It sounds unbelievable today, but for a long period in history, crying wasn't just an emotional reaction. It was treated as a sign that the mind or body had a hidden disorder that needed to be fixed. Back then, people didn't understand emotions the way we do now. Many believed every feeling had a physical root inside the body, and tears were seen as a warning that something had gone wrong deep within. So when a person cried too much, doctors weren't thinking about sadness, stress, or heartbreak. They believed the person's body was producing too much fluid, or that the mind had become overheated, or that the nerves had been overstimulated. These ideas sound strange now, but at that time they were accepted as medical facts. Because of these beliefs, people who cried often were not comforted, they were examined. Their diets were controlled, their sleep was monitored, their daily routines were changed. Doctors believed crying meant the body needed to be rebalanced, so patients were sometimes told to stay indoors, avoid excitement, or even stay silent for long hours. Imagine that, being told to avoid speaking simply because you cried. In some cases, crying was linked to a condition people back then called melancholia, which today we know as depression. But unlike modern understanding, this condition wasn't treated with therapy or support. Instead, it was treated like a physical illness. People were given harsh remedies, cold baths, or long periods of isolation, with the belief that removing stimulation would calm the mind. Religious leaders also played a role. Some taught that constant crying meant the soul was troubled or that the person had unspoken guilt weighing them down. So instead of receiving emotional support, many were told to confess, repent, or pray more. This made crying seem even more like a dangerous sign rather than a natural human response. Socially, people became afraid of crying publicly because it could easily be misunderstood as a sign of weakness, instability, or even spiritual danger. So, instead of expressing their feelings, many learned to hide them. But how did something so natural become something people feared so deeply? People didn't just struggle privately with crying. It became something society watched closely. And it all began when early thinkers believed every emotion had a physical source inside the body. So whenever someone cried too often, the community didn't see it as sadness, they saw it as a sign of inner malfunction. That belief spread quietly. Soon homes developed unspoken rules. Children were told that crying too much meant something was wrong inside them. Adults controlled their tears because they feared being judged as unstable. The idea wasn't cruelty, it was the medical mindset of the time. People truly believed crying was a symptom that needed managing, like a fever or dizziness. This belief entered workplaces too. Anyone who cried easily was labeled weak-nerved or overheated. Workers were encouraged to avoid emotional stress, not because of productivity, but because crying was seen as a medical warning sign. Managers didn't want to deal with someone who might be physically unbalanced. Religious leaders added another layer. They taught that frequent crying could be a spiritual sign, a struggle of the soul rather than the body. Sometimes it was interpreted as guilt, other times as a sign of emotional temptation. So people held back their tears during gatherings, afraid that others would assume something spiritual was wrong with them. Families responded by hiding emotional moments. Parents comforted children, but always with caution. They didn't want their child to be labeled with a disorder. Adults learned to wipe tears quickly before others noticed. Public crying became rare not because people were stronger, but because beliefs shaped behavior. Even early medical guides advised families to monitor anyone who cried too much. They recommended calm routines, quiet environments, and limited excitement. These suggestions weren't meant to punish, they were attempts to protect the mind. But gradually, they created a culture where tears were treated like a medical threat. And behind all this, ordinary people carried silent pressure. Someone who naturally cried when moved by music, stories, or memories had to suppress it. People learned to breathe deeply, clench their faces, or look away whenever emotion built up, not because they wanted to hide, but because history taught them that crying was an illness trying to surface. But as these beliefs grew stronger, did anyone stop to question whether tears were truly a symptom or just a misunderstood part of being human? As beliefs continued to evolve, crying slowly entered the world of early science in a much more structured way. Thinkers began examining tears, trying to understand why the body released them at all. Because so little was known about emotions, many assumed that frequent crying pointed to deeper physical weaknesses. This wasn't meant to shame people, it was simply how the science of the time interpreted the body. Some early medical explanations claimed that tears came from a buildup of emotional pressure. Others believed the body released tears when the inner balance was disturbed. These ideas might sound simple now, but back then they shaped how communities reacted to anyone who cried too easily. People were taught that too many tears meant the body was struggling to regulate itself. That belief spread into homes in subtle ways. Families encouraged controlled calmness, especially in children. A child who cried often was immediately checked on, not for comfort, but for signs of emotional strain. Parents monitored moods the same way they monitored appetite or sleep. Crying wasn't seen as misbehavior, it was seen as a physical signal that something inside needed attention. Teachers approached it similarly. A student who burst into tears was often separated from others, not as punishment, but as care. The goal was to prevent emotional overflow, which was considered unhealthy. Classrooms became places where emotional expression was managed carefully, especially for young learners who hadn't yet learned how to hide their tears. Adults felt the impact even more strongly. If a worker cried in public, people around them worried they were facing emotional exhaustion. Colleagues encouraged rest or a slower pace, believing tears were a sign the mind was under stress. This wasn't mockery, it was the belief system of the time, shaping behavior. Even social gatherings were affected. People avoided heavy topics because conversation that stirred strong feelings could lead to tears, and nobody wanted to risk being viewed as medically fragile. Emotional restraint became a quiet rule. People moved through life trying to appear balanced, steady, and controlled. These early interpretations turned a natural human response into something measured and monitored, and as these ideas spread across generations, crying became less of an emotional moment and more of a medical concern. But as society accepted these assumptions, did anyone wonder whether tears were truly signs of disorder or simply signs of being alive? As these early ideas continued to shape daily life, emotional restraint slowly turned into an expectation. What began as concern for a person's health grew into a cultural standard. People learned to hold themselves with firmness, believing calmness represented strength and stability. In this environment, crying became something to avoid, not only for medical reasons, but for social acceptance. Communities started to believe that frequent crying weakened a person's reputation. A tearful moment could raise concerns about someone's reliability or emotional endurance. This wasn't meant to judge harshly, it reflected the belief that tears signaled imbalance. People felt pressure to appear steady even when their emotions ran deep. The goal was to show control because control was associated with a healthy mind. Families responded by teaching emotional discipline from a young age. Children were encouraged to breathe deeply, stay composed, and hold themselves together. Adults believed they were protecting them from being seen as weak or overwhelmed. Little by little, these teachings became tradition. A child who cried easily was gently corrected, not out of frustration, but out of fear that uncontrolled emotions might follow them into adulthood. Work environments amplified this mindset. A tearful moment during stressful tasks raised fears of burnout. Supervisors encouraged breaks or pauses to prevent emotional strain. People spoke softly about those who cried too often, describing them as under pressure. These conversations shaped how workers behaved, making them more careful about revealing their feelings. Even gatherings meant for relaxation were influenced. Hosts tried to create peaceful atmospheres to avoid emotional triggers. People avoided sharing personal burdens in group settings, worried that an emotional reaction would place them under unwanted attention. Instead, they saved their feelings for private, quiet spaces. Religious and spiritual beliefs strengthened these ideas. Emotional silence was praised as a sign of inner strength. Tears were described as signals of spiritual heaviness or emotional instability. This created a mindset where tears were treated not only as a medical concern, but as a moral challenge. Over time, these beliefs changed how people understood themselves. Tears, which once served as natural responses, became warnings. People lived aware of every emotional shift, trying to stay composed at all costs. As emotional control became more valued, people began turning to different practices to manage crying. What had once been a natural human response was now something people felt obligated to regulate. This led communities to look toward early medical, social, and spiritual methods for guidance. Each group offered its own explanation, and together they shaped how society responded to tears. Medical thinkers of the time believed that the body worked best when emotions stayed balanced. They described crying as something that drained a person's energy, leaving them tired or vulnerable. Because of this belief, they encouraged calm routines, proper rest, and steady habits to prevent emotional overuse. People learned to watch for signs of overwhelming feelings the same way they watched for signs of physical sickness. Social groups added their own rules. They encouraged people to interact calmly, speak softly, and avoid intense discussions. This wasn't because they disliked emotion, it was because they thought sudden tears could spread distress. A quiet environment was seen as healthier. As a result, gatherings became gentler and more structured. People avoided topics that could trigger sadness, and emotional conversations were saved for private moments. Spiritual leaders taught that emotional discipline kept the mind clear. They believed inner calm helped people stay focused and connected to their values. Tears, if too frequent, were described as a sign that someone needed spiritual grounding. This didn't mean tears were forbidden, they were simply treated cautiously. Many people followed these teachings, trying to maintain emotional steadiness in their daily lives. These influences changed how people handled stressful moments. Instead of expressing emotion right away, they paused, breathed, and steadied themselves. If someone felt tears coming, they stepped aside, taking time to settle their mind. People believed this protected their health, their social standing, and their sense of spiritual control. Children were taught these practices early. When they cried, adults gently guided them toward composure. Over time, young people learned to handle emotions quietly. They grew into adults who believed patience and silence were signs of maturity. These ideas continued to spread generation after generation. Emotional control became an expectation, and tears remained something people monitored closely. Even though tears were natural, Society treated them as something that needed careful management. As emotional restraint deepened, daily life began to reflect this quiet pressure. People were not forced into silence, but they grew up surrounded by rules that shaped how they behaved, spoke, and even comforted others. Over time, society developed its own unwritten system for dealing with tears, and these expectations quietly influenced every generation. Homes were the first place where this shift was most visible. Parents encouraged children to stay composed during difficult moments, teaching them small techniques like breathing slowly, sitting still, or focusing on a steady point in the room. These methods were passed down the same way people taught reading, writing, or manners. Children learned that calmness was a sign of strength and crying was something to be handled privately. Workplaces also adopted this mindset. People believed emotional steadiness made them more dependable. If someone became overwhelmed, even for a moment, they often stepped aside until they could gather themselves. It wasn't seen as shameful, it was simply the expected way to maintain dignity and order. Over time, emotional control became connected to professionalism, shaping how people behaved in public settings. Spiritual groups continued to encourage inner stillness. They taught that emotions were part of life but required balance. People practiced routines of reflection, quiet prayer, or meditation-like habits to keep their feelings steady. These practices reinforced the belief that controlling tears showed maturity and self-awareness. Even celebrations changed. People remained joyful, but they kept their emotions measured. Too much expression, whether happiness or sadness, felt out of place in a culture that valued steadiness. This didn't remove emotion from life, but it influenced how openly people expressed it. Medical ideas added structure to these beliefs. Early emotional theories suggested that too much crying could drain a person mentally and physically. So people took care to avoid emotional overload. They rested often, kept stable routines, and avoided situations that stirred intense feelings. The goal was not to prevent tears completely, but to make sure they never became overwhelming. These influences slowly shaped a society where emotional caution became the norm. People didn't question it, they simply lived the way generations before them had taught. But as emotional restraint became deeply rooted, a quiet question remained. If crying is natural, what happens when people are taught to hide it for too long? As the belief in emotional control settled across generations, something subtle but significant began to happen. People no longer discussed why crying had once been treated with concern. They simply continued the habits they inherited. What began as early medical theory and cultural caution gradually transformed into tradition, quiet, unquestioned, and deeply rooted. Children grew up learning that holding back tears was a mark of maturity. They watched adults remain composed during stress, disagreements, and personal loss. These lessons shaped how they viewed their own feelings. Many learned to swallow their emotions quickly, believing it made life easier for themselves and others. Showing sadness became something done rarely and only in trusted moments. As adults, these same individuals passed the habits down again. They comforted their children not by encouraging expression, but by teaching calmness. Stay strong, take a breath, and don't let it overwhelm you became familiar phrases. No one meant harm, they simply repeated what they had been taught. Over time, the original reasons faded, but the behavior remained. Public life reflected this shift as well. People carried themselves with quiet composure, even during difficult moments. They learned to release emotion only in private spaces, inside homes, behind closed doors, or during moments of solitude. Tears became a personal matter rather than a shared one. This emotional culture shaped relationships too. Many people formed deep bonds based on understanding rather than expression. They didn't always talk openly about their feelings, but they found other ways to show support, through actions, presence, or gentle silence. Yet beneath this calm exterior, many carried emotions they rarely expressed outwardly. Despite all of this, crying never disappeared. It remained a natural human response, something the body does to release stress, heal the mind, and rebalance emotions. Even people who rarely cried understood that tears still served a purpose. They may not have shown them often, but they felt them just the same. With time, society reached a quiet balance. Emotional control was valued, but people gradually recognized that crying was not a weakness, it was simply human. And now the question remains for anyone hearing this story today. If you were raised in a world where crying was treated as a disorder, would you follow the rules or would you let your emotions be seen? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.